Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting lecture here in History 17B, and welcome to the second half of our look at the modern civil rights era, and in particular the issue of race in that civil rights era. In our first lecture on this topic, we examined the period from 1954 to 1963, a period that would see dramatic change in the way in which the federal government became once again in a lead role in the cause of securing civil rights for vulnerable minorities, a period where we saw the dogged, determined activism of activists to secure a more democratic, just America, but also a period where we saw a backlash to those efforts almost from the beginning. And cumulatively, those are the elements you should keep in mind here as we examine race and civil rights in the post-World War II era, the dramatic and remarkable changes of this period, where the changes come from, top-down federal government, who's responsible for forcing that change, grassroots efforts by activists and people who are literally putting their lives on the line to make America a more democratic and just society, and also the backlash to those efforts. And that speaks to one of the themes that we are stressing here: what changes in this period and what doesn't change. Here in the second part of our look at race and civil rights, we're going to continue, pick up where we last left off in that fateful year of 1963, and in this lecture examine some further developments in the modern civil rights era during the mid-1960s. 1963 is a key year in the history of the modern civil rights movement. As we examined in our previous lecture, 1963 would see a wave of protest around the country, an expanded civil rights effort that now targeted not just the end of racial discrimination in public spaces, but a call for greater opportunities in the economy and housing and education. 1963 would see the battle in Birmingham, clashes between Martin Luther King Jr. and the activists there marching for the right to vote, the right to, indeed, be full and equal members of this nation, clashing with the police, Klansmen, all captured on television. 1963 would see the March on Washington, where 250,000 Americans would descend on the nation's capital, what was imagined to be the capital of democracy around the globe, and demand some democracy here at home. Jobs and freedom was the slogan of that March on Washington, demonstrative of both the higher ideals of the civil rights movement that always couched its arguments in the language of freedom, but also the tangible benefits that these civil rights activists sought: housing, education, the things that truly make you free. One more key event in 1963, the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in November of that year in Dallas. Kennedy had promised to sign the Civil Rights Bill if it passed through Congress. Kennedy came out in favor of that Civil Rights Bill that was the focus of the March on Washington in the summer of 1963, a march that was designed in part to build popular opinion, popular support for the passage of that Civil Rights Bill. Kennedy said, if it passes, I'll sign it into law. It's part of one of the themes we see here at this moment in American history, the shift in the Democratic Party as it is becoming the party of civil rights. As I'll talk about in a lecture coming soon on the modern conservative movement, up until the 1960s, the South, the states of the old Confederacy, the Deep South, was known as the Solid South in its support for the Democratic Party. This goes back to the Civil War. Lincoln was a Republican, and so Southern states, many of which were part of that Confederacy, were opposed to the Republican Party and remained loyal in their support of the Democratic Party for the next 100 years. Now, that began to erode a bit in the New Deal era, where with the New Deal policies, the more interventionist role of the government in society, and to some extent the more welcoming, generous vision the New Deal offered for American society, political loyalties began to shift as some African Americans who were lifelong Republicans, the party of Lincoln, the party of Thaddeus Stevens, and the radical Republicans, shift their loyalty towards the Democrats, and some whites in the South, seeing what the New Deal represented, shifted to the Republican Party, but that shift deepens and accelerates in the 1960s, where in this period the Democratic Party, which had long been the party of the South, the party of the old Confederacy, the party of the Klan, is shifting to become the party of civil rights. It will be a Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, who will sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It will be a Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, who will sign into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, that changes our immigration laws and opens the doors to immigrants from around the world in 1965. So in the 1960s, the Democratic Party was shifting to becoming the party of civil rights, and that's represented by Kennedy, a Northern Democrat from Massachusetts who supported the Civil Rights Bill that was under debate in Congress in the summer of 1963. When Kennedy goes to Dallas in November of 1963, he's going there in part to shore up his support in Texas, which then still was a blue state, part of that solid South, because he had come out in favor of civil rights. He feared that it would turn that state red, and so he went to Dallas. When he shot in Dallas, many people immediately assumed it was the Klan. Many people assumed that the assassin that killed Kennedy was doing so in the name of white supremacy because Kennedy had come out in favor of civil rights. When he shot and killed his then widow, Jacqueline Kennedy says, "Oh my God, they shot him," because she, like many, assumed it was the Klan, that Kennedy was the next martyr in the civil rights era. Turned out it was a loner named Lee Harvey Oswald who held a grudge against Kennedy because of his anti-communist, anti-Cuba politics. But at the time, many people assumed it was the Klan because Kennedy had come out in favor of civil rights. Well, now there was a martyr, and Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, is sworn in as president, and he makes this his cause, that Kennedy's death shall not be in vain, that the civil rights bill that Kennedy supported must pass. Lyndon Johnson was a veteran of Congress. He was very adroit at getting legislation passed through, particularly the Senate, and was able to put pressure on congressmen and senators to pass that civil rights bill so that he, as president now, after Kennedy's assassination, could sign it into law, being that Democratic president who would sign into law that landmark civil rights legislation. There are anecdotes of Lyndon Johnson literally grabbing congressmen and senators by their shirts. He was a big, tall, tough Texan. He could be very intimidating. He would grab them by their lapels, by their shirts, and say, "You're going to pass this bill." So again, it isn't as if one day in 1964 every American politician woke up and said, "You know what? We should pass legislation ending Jim Crow because we want to make a more just, democratic America." It took a great deal of effort. Arguably, it took the death of a president, John Kennedy, to make this possible. But in this context, it was possible now to pass that Civil Rights Act. Enough congressmen and senators, under pressure from Johnson, were willing to now vote for legislation that ended what was left of Jim Crow. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race in a host of public and private institutions. You could no longer have a business that says, "We don't serve blacks. We don't serve Latinos. We don't serve Filipinos." You could no longer have racially discriminatory hiring practices where you say, "We don't hire blacks, Latinos, Filipinos." Labor unions could no longer discriminate based on race. Public hospitals, like those who turned away Medgar Evers and others, could not say, "We don't serve African Americans." So this was remarkable. Now, again, in the previous lecture, we saw the slow, steady decline of Jim Crow discrimination, apartheid, through first the Brown decision, later the Montgomery bus boycott. It is a slow but steady process. With the Civil Rights Act of 1964, what was left of legal discrimination based on race fell. And so this is a landmark change, ending through federal action here. Now, again, note where change is coming from. This is not, again, all of a sudden every American looking at each other and saying, "You know what? Blacks and whites should be equal. We should end this world of apartheid and discrimination." It's not about changing hearts and minds, attitudes. There'll be a backlash to this, as we'll see, much like there was to the changes earlier. Instead, the change is coming through law, and it's coming from the federal government, top down. So the federal government telling individuals, businesses, private businesses, which this applied to, institutions in American life, you can no longer discriminate based on race. So it's a legal change, not a change in attitudes. That's important for speaking to this theme of what changes and what doesn't. It's a change that comes through law, and it is a change that comes from the federal government, because many states, many individuals, maybe many private businesses in America were not inclined to end legal discrimination based on race. This had to be forced upon them through federal action. So there's a lot here, again, that's revelatory to the complexity of our story of civil rights. And because it comes from the federal government, top down, because it's a legal change, it doesn't change attitudes. It doesn't change the inclination of many whites who will still refuse to live side by side as equals with racial minorities. And it's tough to change a society that for centuries was rooted in white supremacy, racial hierarchy, with one act of legislation. So change and unchange. It changes everything, but it changes only a few things in some ways. It changes in terms of the legal status of racial minorities a great deal by ending that formalized institutional discrimination. But in lived reality, in day-to-day interaction, in attitudes, this doesn't affect that, as it is a change in law from the federal government. What's interesting about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is that it is as important in the story of race and civil rights as it is in the story of feminism in the 1960s. In a lecture soon, we'll talk about another major social transformation in the 1960s. At this point in the class, you hopefully will be staggered by how revolutionary the 1960s truly was as a decade. It is the decade of civil rights, but it's also the decade of feminism, gay rights, the counterculture. It is a remarkable time of social change. So in the 1960s, you have the efforts that we have enunciated here and will continue to enunciate in regards to race and civil rights. You also have this really strong burgeoning feminist movement. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is vital to that history of feminism that's developing at the exact same time here in the 1960s, because in addition to banning discrimination based on race, it also bans discrimination based on sex, meaning you can no longer discriminate based on sex in things like hiring and public accommodations in private businesses. And this happens really by accident. The original formulation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the one that Kennedy supported before his death in 63, did not have this element to it. This was added by Southern congressmen and senators, not because they were rabid feminists who really believed in sexual equality, but because they were trying to make the bill even more radical and ultimately sabotage the bill. They believe that if we add this to it, if we add as well a ban on discrimination based on sex, well, many who do support it now as it is exclusively focused on race will no longer support it. They'll say, well, I want to support the legislation when it was about ending racial discrimination, but if it's going to make men and women equal under law, well, I'm not on board for that. So this was a last-ditch effort by Southern congressmen and senators to stop the bill. They added something that would make it even more transformative. They added this element of the Civil Rights Act that banned discrimination based on sex, and it blew up in their face because it passed anyway. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 turned out to be much more revolutionary than it originally was formulated to be. It turned out to be a key force for ending discrimination based on sex in employment, in public life, in public accommodations, and it came to be through the efforts of racists in the South, congressmen and senators who were trying to stop the bill from being passed. And so it turned out to be even more radical than originally formulated to be. There is an important lacuna here, a missing element that, as we've already documented, is central and vital to the activism of this period, whether it is the campaign The freedom riders, the voter registration efforts we've talked about, the larger vision of a more free, just, and democratic America, voting rights. Voting rights are key in American history, not only because they empower people to be politically efficacious, active, able to influence the political order, but voting rights have great symbolism in America. They symbolize citizenship. You know you're a citizen because you can vote. Throughout our history, voting rights have been limited in a way that defines narrowly the vision of we the people by excluding Native Americans, African Americans, and women. When this nation began, the only people who could vote were white male property owners. When in the 1820s and 1830s, the property owning requirement to vote ended, it still meant the only people who could vote were white men, and it seemed to indicate that the only people who were true citizens of this nation were white men. So voting rights have always been synonymous with images, ideas, identities of citizenship. What, again, is the answer to that stubborn question of who is an American? So voting rights were key to civil rights, not only because it would empower millions of people who were denied political voice, political power, the right to influence political affairs. It would make them active participants in our democracy, but also it was another way of addressing that key element of civil rights in the larger story of America, citizenship, by granting to people who had been consciously and deliberately denied voting rights that key emblem, that key badge of citizenship. As transformative as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was, as transformative as it came to be, beyond its original formulation to indeed also be vital to the cause of sexual equality, it did not address this key goal of civil rights, voting rights. And that lacuna, that missing element, would be glaringly obvious in events that would transpire in 1964 and 1965, leading to the next major development, legal change in the civil rights era, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In June of 1964, 3 civil rights activists, 3 individuals engaging in that effort to encourage African Americans to register to vote, to employ their constitutional rights, and be politically engaged and efficacious, were killed in the tiny town of Philadelphia, Mississippi. This event will later be commemorated in a book and film called Mississippi Burning. As we'll talk about in a lecture coming soon on that modern conservative movement, 16 years later, the Republican candidate for the White House, Ronald Reagan, will give a speech in the city that becomes synonymous with racialized violence, part of a Southern strategy that will also be vital to the story of political shifts in the 1960s, particularly in the South. So Philadelphia, Mississippi, remains in many ways one of these flashpoint locations like Selma, Birmingham, Montgomery of the modern civil rights movement, because it is a city synonymous with that backlash to civil rights, the effort and willingness of white supremacists to employ terrorism and violence, kidnapping and murdering 3 young men who were there in Philadelphia, Mississippi, trying to make America a more democratic nation. This is a period of violence, as we've documented previously. It's a period where, sadly, blood is shed. People become martyrs, die, because they were daring to challenge racial hierarchy and white supremacy. In the early 1960s, many African American activists had been killed, and we talked about some of them, like Medgar Evers. Many who were freedom riders or activists in a variety of different student efforts, CORE, SNCC, were also kidnapped and killed. But the activists who were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 2 of them were white. And many historians argue that that element of this story, the Mississippi burning story, the death of these civil rights activists, is why it would prove to be such a catalyst to the Voting Rights Act that would follow in 1965. That white America was particularly angry and outraged that now some of their boys were being killed. that it wasn't just African American activists who were being killed. 2 of the 3 killed in Mississippi were white, and many historians argue that played a role in, again, changing attitudes or changing political loyalties of the moment and building support for securing voting rights for all, as that was indeed the reason why those activists were in Philadelphia, Mississippi. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, what civil rights activists were demanding wasn't anything beyond, anything extra. It was what should already be the rights of all Americans in a free and democratic nation. And for pursuing that, they were killed by white supremacists. In January of 1965, Dr. King leads his march on Selma, and there John Lewis would be brutally attacked, his skull fractured as he marched defiantly in a cause for democracy, in a cause for voting rights. Selma was chosen in part because it was so demonstrative of the lack of democracy in America, even in this Cold War era when we are arguing that we're a beacon of freedom and democracy around the globe. Selma, Alabama had an African American population of around 15,000, but only 355 of that 15,000 were registered to vote. Is that because only 355 wanted to vote, wanted to be politically active? No. It's because the other 14,000 plus feared for their lives if they merely filled out a registration card. Because in Selma and in so many parts of this nation, in the early 60s, not that long ago, simply filling out a registration card, simply filling out a card saying, I might vote, I might intend to vote, was enough to be beaten, even killed. And so you had terrorism. You had an American population of citizens, many of whom were veterans, who had served this nation, who feared for their lives as they filled out a registration card. And so Dr. King, John Lewis, and others marched there in Selma, demanding democracy here at home, and for that they were beaten and attacked, all this again captured on TV. Whose side are you on? Are you on the side of the Americans, many of whom were veterans, many of whom had sacrificed and served in wars like World War II and Korea, who just wanted to vote? Or are you on the side of the Klan, the cops, who are beating them with whips and tire chains and electrified cattle prods? We were at, again, a moment of moral calculus with a very clear, stark choice. And in response to violence, bloodshed in America, martyrs, once again, 3 men who had died in Philadelphia, more who would die in the months that followed into early 65, where activism like that at Selma was staged around the country. That same president who had signed the Civil Rights Act into law in 1964, the next year would sign into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, it's important to note that the Voting Rights Act does not grant people the right to vote. As I mentioned in previous lectures, in 1965, anyone who was of age, and the age in this period was 21 in most states, if you're 21, you should be able to vote. Because the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, says you cannot deny someone the right to vote based on race, and the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, says you cannot deny someone the right to vote based on sex. So whether you are a man or a woman, if you're old enough, you should be able to vote in 1965. But effectively, millions of people around the country, because of the color of their skin, could not vote as they faced poll taxes, understanding clauses, violence, terrorism, intimidation. That's why only 355 black residents of Selma, Alabama were registered to vote. So the Voting Rights Act doesn't grant people the right to vote. They already have the right to vote. They just couldn't exercise it because of the various means used to deny American citizens the right to vote. Instead, what the Voting Rights Act does, it empowers the federal government to hold elections in parts of the country that have these long legacies of voter discrimination. What is happening here is the federal government is saying to Selma, Alabama, and municipalities around the country, you don't get to run your elections anymore. We're going to run them. Because when you run your elections, you don't let citizens vote. You allow all these means to take place that prevent African Americans and other racial minorities from voting. So it's again about the federal government forcing states, individuals, cities, municipalities to do what they're not inclined to do. In this case, let every citizen vote. It's about big government. It's about federal government intervening. It's about forcing individuals and states, cities to do what they're not inclined to do. It's top down. It's big government. It's, again, that theme we've stressed here in our look at civil rights. So the next time you hear someone rail against big government, well, remember what you've learned in these lectures. It wasn't for big government, whether it was the Reconstruction period or this second Reconstruction, well, we wouldn't have the gains in regards to civil rights that we enjoy today. That's the Civil Rights Act. It allowed the federal government now to take over elections in parts of the country that had this long history and pattern of voting discrimination. This now signed into law by that same Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson. It represents that shift in parties. There'll be consequences to that, as we'll talk about in our lecture on the modern conservative movement. It is addressing what had not been addressed by the previous legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as it dealt exclusively focused on voting rights. It's again a product of people who were willing to put their lives on the line, many of whom died in the process to make this a more democratic nation. There's again a lot here in this legislation that fits with the larger themes, contours of these lectures. You had now, for the first time in American history, a democratic nation. We like to imagine that America is a democracy. Certainly in 1965, when this legislation is passed, that was central to our rhetoric in the Cold War, that we were a beacon of democracy, that we were different than communism and its one-party totalitarian rule. But America has only been a democracy since 1965. It's not something at our origins. As I mentioned earlier, when the United States began as a separate sovereign nation after the American Revolution, the only people who could vote were white male property owners. And that continued into the early 19th century. There's this brief moment in the 1870s with the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments where black men can vote, but all women cannot vote. And that lasts only a brief period of time, because by 1877, when Reconstruction ends, well, through poll taxes, understanding clauses, racialized violence, African American men can't vote anymore. And that endures for 100 years of apartheid. And so it really isn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that you could argue America's become a democracy. It isn't a long-standing tradition in America. It is a very recent development. And if you've been paying attention over the last 50, 55 years, it's a change that is under siege. As with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, there's a backlash and efforts to get around this new form of legislation designed to enfranchise racial minorities. We have seen in the last few weeks and months here in 2021 efforts to make it harder to vote, to bring back things that are just new versions of poll taxes, like you have to have an ID that you can only get from a certain office that's only open on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 2:01 to 2:07, and you got to pay $50 to get that ID, right? Closing precincts, making it impossible to register to vote close to an election, ending drop boxes, all of these different efforts. In a recent Supreme Court decision, Shelby County, the Voting Rights Act, major portions of it were overturned. What happened was the current Supreme Court, not the Warren Court we've been learning about in these lectures, but the Roberts Court, the John Roberts Court that we are, to some extent, under right now, ruled, back in 1965, those cities and states, yeah, they were racist and they didn't let racial minorities vote, but it's 2010 and now we live in such a more enlightened age, and we need to end these restrictions that the Voting Rights Act imposed on certain cities. So the Shelby County decision recently by the Roberts Court basically ended huge elements of the Voting Rights Act. It said, you know what, you can run your elections again because now we live again in this post-racialized wonderland. Well, what has that led to? Closing precincts, laws passed that make it onerous and difficult to vote, people standing in 8-hour lines and then a law saying you can't give them water, right? If you have to wait in an 8-hour line to vote, you don't have the right to vote. That is consciously and deliberately created to stop you from voting. So change and unchanged, history fans. A remarkable change, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that for the first time in our long history, finally makes America a democracy where everyone can vote. But almost as soon as it's passed, there are efforts in the decades that follow to undermine that right, to make it more difficult. And right now, we are all living through that. At a fevered pitch, there are efforts around the country right now to make it harder and harder to vote. And so, change and unchange. And a burden that you all inherit. You learned in this lecture here about people who died for the right to vote. That's not an exaggeration. It's not melodrama. It's history. And remember, history is the antidote for histrionics and melodrama. It's stubborn. It's freighted with facts that you can't deny. It is an undeniable fact that people died very recently, within a couple generations, so people could vote. And everyone listening to this lecture, even this jackass giving this lecture, inherits that burden and carries it going forward, because those people shall not die in vain. And if their work is being undermined today in efforts to stop, make it difficult for people to vote, well, we too have to march. We too, like they before us, have to take a stand. Throughout these lectures, I've been stressing to you not to think of the developments in the civil rights era as a linear story of progress, because for every effort and success made in the cause of a more equal, just America, those changes sparked backlashes, and we've seen that in a variety of ways. Some of the backlash was extra-legal. It was intimidation, violence, the beatings and killings, the killing of those civil rights workers in Freedom Summer in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964. But also in 1964, some of that resistance came through more formalized institutional means. In 1964, the year the Civil Rights Act is passed, the year where there is this growing momentum for what will become a Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Republican Party will nominate Barry Goldwater for president. He will be the standard bearer of a Republican Party that's shifting in many ways in the 1960s, as the Democratic Party is also shifting. Barry Goldwater was a senator from Arizona, and while in the Senate, he had voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, making the presidential election of 1964 a bellwether, where you had a very stark choice when you went to the polls and cast your ballot for the presidency. In 1964, you could vote for the liberal Democrat who had signed the Civil Rights Act into law, Lyndon Johnson, or you could vote for the conservative Republican, Barry Goldwater, who had voted against it. You can't get a more stark and absolute choice. You cannot get a more stark and absolute referendum on the issue of civil rights. Lyndon Johnson will win that election in a landslide, but just 4 years later, a conservative Republican from Orange County will be elected president, Richard Nixon, and re-elected in 1972, 49 states to 1. So there's a turn taking place in American politics, a conservative turn, that in part is fueled by a backlash against civil rights. And we'll get into that in a lecture coming soon. The parts of the country that are now subject to federal intervention in things like the Voting Rights Act of 1965 rail against this and talk about states' rights, the very rhetoric of the Confederacy, the rhetoric of the movement to secede from the Union in 1861, sparking the Civil War, secede from the Union to preserve and extend slavery and avoid being subject to a federal government led by Lincoln that was hostile to the expansion of slavery. Well, just like battle flags of the Confederacy get integrated into state flags in Georgia and are flown around the country, it's that same Civil War symbolism and rhetoric that returns here as part of a Southern strategy that Republicans will employ to win over disaffected whites in the South, helping to make major gains for the Republican Party as the Democratic Party becomes the party of civil rights. So backlash takes many different forms. It takes the form of absolute terrorism and violence at the hands of the Klan, Bull Connor, and others. It is also manifest in institutions and political resistance from a Southern manifesto, which we described as a response to the Brown decision, to the Republican Party embracing as its standard bearer Barry Goldwater, who had voted against the Civil Rights Act, and a Republican Party and conservative movement in the years that will follow Goldwater's defeat embracing that Southern strategy that used terms like states' rights, freedom of association as part of its critique of the more interventionist role mandated by the federal government in a civil rights era. You have images like this photograph here of young Americans marching in the streets in the 1960s. Now, when you hear that phrase, young Americans marching in the streets in the 1960s, you might think of civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the anti-Vietnam movement, the counterculture, social trends that we are going to examine at this point in the class. That vision of the 60s as a time of young people in the streets marching for change. Well, these too are young Americans, 1960s, and they are marching with this racist sign in the cause of maintaining white supremacy and racialized hierarchy. And so, as I've stressed in these lectures, it's change and unchange. It's change in law, it's change from the federal government, but that doesn't change hearts and minds. You can't reverse centuries of history with just a few acts of legislation. It's a complicated story. In 1965, America could look back on an 11-year period from the Brown decision in 1954 and capped by the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, of remarkable change. And it is a time of remarkable change to see the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Jim Crow, to see a coalition building of whites and African Americans working side by side to bring about these changes. An end to discrimination in a variety of institutions. But also in 1965, America was awash in the backlashes to those changes. And in many ways, the backlashes to those changes would prevail in the years that come, particularly after 1965, when the civil rights movement would turn to what had yet to be accomplished, tend to focus more on economic issues of education, housing, focus on what had not changed in terms of institutions. And in the late 60s, police brutality became a key focus of the civil rights era. So in the late 60s, the civil rights movement changes. It changes in its focus. It tends to be much more focused on economic change and empowering racial minorities who may now be able to vote and sit at a lunch counter, but had been unable to build wealth for a century, unable to pursue a college education, have one of those good paying union jobs. The focus in the late 60s was increasingly on issues of economics. When Dr. King is assassinated by a white supremacist in Memphis in 1968, he is there in that city standing side by side with garbage workers who were on strike. He was formulating another march on Washington, the Poor People's Campaign, where poor, white, black, Latino, Native American, Asian Americans would march on Washington all over again and demand jobs programs, a New Deal, affordable housing, free college education. Again, Dr. King believed in many of the progressive causes that prevail to this day. And then he's killed. So his activism in the late 60s is demonstrative of where the larger activism was after the Voting Rights Act. And when civil rights tends to focus on those economic issues, when it tends to critique state power like police and the use of coercive police force on brown and black bodies, a lot of the partnership that prevailed in the early 60s between whites and blacks break down, and a lot of whites cleave in a conservative direction, making the post-65 era one of greater ascendancy for a conservative movement that will openly court white voters through its Southern strategy. So 1965 is a very telling year because it's a year of dramatic and remarkable change with the Voting Rights Act and the Hart-Celler Act, which we'll talk about in our final lecture on immigration, ways in which an 11-year period had spanned where America had become a much more racially equitable nation. But after 1965, the country will cleave in a very conservative direction. So change, backlash, change, and unchange. Let's wrap up this lecture by talking about the efforts of other racial minorities in the same period in the post-World War II era. As much as the 1960s was a time of black power, it was also a time of red power, the term that was used to describe the growing Native American activist efforts and advocacy. Now, after World War II, both the Democratic administration of Harry Truman and the Republican administration of Dwight Eisenhower had emphasized once again the idea that Native Americans should assimilate into the dominant white culture. Some time ago, back in our lecture on the New Deal era, I talked about John Collier, who was the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and how he was a strong advocate for Native American sovereignty, Native American culture. He argued that Native American culture is just as much a part of America as any other cultural strain. He argued that Native American culture should be respected, honored, and seen as fully American. But after World War II, in the Truman and Eisenhower administration, the emphasis was once again on assimilation, this idea that Native Americans should reject their identity with their history, the tribe that they come from, their tribal language and identity and culture, and assimilate into what was imagined to be the consensus mainstream American society. This was the containment era. It was the era that placed great emphasis on uniformity, conformity, a consensus, this idea that America is a place of freedom and democracy, in contradistinction to communism. We should all rally around the flag, rally around our leaders, and that led to the termination policy. Now, when Native Americans hear this idea that there's a termination policy coming from the federal government, they said, well, haven't we been struggling with that since 1492, right? But not literally terminating Native Americans in the genocidal campaigns we talked about much earlier in the class in the 19th century. But instead, the idea that Native Americans should terminate their connection to, again, their tribal identities, their tribal culture, religions, languages. The termination policy was urging Native Americans to move away from reservations, to move to big cities, to move to the suburbs, to integrate in many ways into what was imagined, again, the consensus mainstream American society. And that created a backlash among Native Americans who wanted to hold on to their identity, their history, their culture, their languages, particularly the children of that termination policy, or those who were affected by it. There is this phenomenon that's taking place in the 50s where many Native Americans are being urged or sometimes compelled to relocate to urban areas, pushed off reservations, ironically, considering what we learned about earlier in the class, where Native Americans were forced onto reservations as part of this effort of the termination policy to urge them to divest themselves of their culture and traditions. Well, the children of those who were subject to the termination policy grew up in the 60s, a time of activism, and they help advance this Red Power movement that advocated for racial pride, advocated for tribal sovereignty, urged Native Americans to embrace their culture, their heritage, and that leads to this Red Power movement that is well symbolized by AIM, the American Indian Movement, which formed in 1968 during the height of the civil rights era and activism, advocating for just that. The idea that Native Americans should be proud to be Native Americans, they should know their heritage, their history, they should not try to divest themselves of those cultural traditions, and that the pathway forward is one of civil rights activism in the cause of redress. The American Indian Movement and the broader Red Power movement focused on, like the efforts of African Americans, economic opportunity, economic redress, economic visions of civil rights, because it often advocated for restoring to Native American tribes land, resources, watersheds that had been taken away from Native Americans in the 18th and 19th century, when Native Americans faced wars of aggression, efforts to force them onto reservations, asymmetrical treaties that saw Native Americans lose their land. We talked earlier in the class about things like the Dawes Act. We talked about how in the Gilded Age there was this full frontal assault on Native American sovereignty, and many Native Americans in the process lost land, resources, and the American Indian Movement focused on redressing those wrongs and restoring rights, control of watersheds. There were efforts here in California in the early 20th century by corporations to strip Native Americans of land and resources, power companies that wanted to rig Northern California for electricity or build hydroelectric dams, were successful in leveraging their power with the help of the California state government and the federal government to strip Native Americans of land in the state. And AIM wanted to restore those land rights. So there are many parallels between the efforts of Red Power, Black Power, the efforts of Native Americans and African Americans. There was an emphasis on racial pride. There was an emphasis on economic opportunity. There was an emphasis on activism, advocacy, demanding change. The most vibrant incident in this era in regards to the Red Power movement was staged by an offshoot of AIM, the Indians of all tribes, here in California, when they occupied Alcatraz Island. There is a direct connection between this Native American advocacy group, the Indians of all tribes, and that termination policy. After World War II, Native Americans were urged or sometimes forced to relocate to cities like San Francisco. Their children grew up and entered a civil rights era of the 1960s as student activists, forming groups like AIM and the Indians of all tribes, because they saw the direct impact of the wrongs of the termination policy against their parents. So when Native Americans were forced to cities like San Francisco, there was this idea in the termination era, well, this will make them less committed to their identity. It has the opposite effect because their children grow up in this period of activism. And the Indians of all tribes was a group of Native American activists in San Francisco that in 1969 seized Alcatraz Island. Now, Alcatraz Island is best known today as a tourist attraction, a national park, but in 1969 it hadn't yet transitioned to that. It was no longer a federal prison. There was no longer an active prison there. The prison had closed, and all the inmates there had been relocated to other prisons in California. So it was basically vacant. It was no longer a functioning prison, but it hadn't yet opened as a national park. And that was part of the very clever argument that the Indians of all tribes made for claiming Alcatraz. They said, no one's using it, it's ours. It was a very clever argument because that was the exact same argument used by Europeans when they colonized North America in the 15, 16, 17 centuries. They said, oh, no one's using it, it's ours, basically ignoring the land rights of Native Americans and seizing it through force. And that's the argument the Indians of all tribes were using. Oh, no one's using it, it's ours, which forced America to revisit in many ways that colonial era when Europeans came and warred against Native Americans, stripped them of their land, all with this justification, well, you weren't using it, it's ours now. The occupation of Alcatraz Island became a sensation. People were fascinated by this. Rock bands went and lived with these Native American activists. The rock band Creedence Clearwater Revival, the Dudes' favorite band, bought the Indians of all tribes a boat so they could go back and forth and resupply or go back to San Francisco to see friends and family. Movie stars like Marlon Brando went out to Alcatraz and stayed very briefly with the Indians of all tribes and were prominently photographed. So it became kind of a big celebration, a big deal. It attracted celebrities like so many of these things. It devolved into a media sensation. But it served, therefore, to focus America's attention on a group who had long been either maligned or ignored. And so this was a key catalyst to greater awareness of, indeed, histories of dispossession against Native Americans. The Indians of all tribes in various ways continued to occupy Alcatraz Island into 1971, when finally the governor of California, Ronald Reagan, cut off water and electricity to the island, but that meant there was this long-standing visible effort to raise awareness of, again, the history of discrimination against Native Americans and their current plight as they suffered under treaties that stripped Native Americans of sovereignty, rights, and economic opportunity. From Alcatraz came other acts of civil disobedience, another parallel here between Red Power and the efforts of African Americans we have detailed earlier. There was an effort to occupy Mount Rushmore. There was an effort to seize the replica of the Mayflower 2. So the early 70s was a time of greater awareness of Native Americans, their presence within American society, American history, and the way in which they too, like so many Americans, suffered from discrimination and prejudice. Now, as I mentioned, and so often happens in activism, and you can think about some parallels today of what happens to sincere activism, this effort by Native Americans ultimately was co-opted by consumerism and the media culture. There were a lot of music, a lot of songs in the early 70s expressing this idea of Native American or then Indian pride. Cher is on TV with her braids claiming to have some sort of portion of Native American heritage. So you had this phenomenon called Indian chic in the early 70s where it now became cool and marketable to claim Native American heritage, or Native American imagery became very, again, freighted with cultural cachet and subject to all kinds of iterations in consumer capitalism. Consumerism often co-opts sincere and heartfelt political movements and turns them into things to sell. And that happened in the early 70s. But these acts of civil disobedience continued, and they ultimately bore fruit because the Nixon administration in the early 70s took action to restore a lot of rights, including restoration of land rights, control of watersheds to Native Americans around the country. Even the conservative Republican Richard Nixon had to bend to the pressure that came with this Red Power movement. So they too were ultimately successful in many of their efforts, particularly in regards to economic redress, which was so vital to their efforts in the cause of civil rights and the efforts of many racial minorities in this period. So the 1960s saw the activism of African Americans. It saw the activism as well of Native Americans, part of the way in which this is a period of remarkable change. It was a time of red power, black power, and was also described as brown power. It was also a time where Latinos were in the streets demanding change in the cause of civil rights. In the 1960s, the word Chicano was coined by intellectuals and activists to describe the unique experience of people of Mexican descent in American history, Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans who for decades had been subject to the same forces of exclusion, discrimination that African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans had been touched by. There were efforts in the United States in the early 20th century to employ violence, terrorism, and intimidation against Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans. There were mass deportation efforts in the 1930s. There was the Citrus War here locally in Orange County in 1936, where the local police and others partnered with the growers, beat and attacked striking Latino workers, most of whom were of Mexican descent, forcing them back on the job. So in the 1960s, in this time of greater activism, awareness, amidst this great racial reckoning, there emerged an opportunity for an expression of Chicano power as part of a larger field of Latino activism that included Puerto Ricans in New York City and parts of the Northeast. A variety of efforts here also developing in the 1960s alongside the efforts of Native Americans and African Americans. Within the Chicano movement, there was a form of activism that combined the activism in the name of brown power, of greater awareness, activism for Latinos, and feminism, as I've already stressed and will develop more in lectures to come. The 1960s is this remarkable period where not only do you have the activism in the cause of civil rights for racial minorities, as we've documented in these lectures, but it's also a time of a budding and developing feminism, where women too are in the streets demanding change and seeking many of the reforms that we've seen here in regards to racial minorities, access to education, access to employment, an end to formal discrimination. And so the 1960s is a time of race, racial activism, civil rights by racial minorities, and feminism. And within the Chicano movement, there was a feminist movement led by young Latinas who simultaneously critiqued racism, white supremacy, the efforts to indeed deny Latinos equality and opportunity, and the way in which Latinas in particular were also subject to sexism, a sexism that they sometimes found within their own community in a tradition of machismo, which dissuaded young Latinas from pursuing education, career, a life of their own making. So there's this interesting development within the Latino activism within the Chicano movement by Chicanas who are simultaneously critiquing racism, the way in which they, as Americans of Mexican descent, are subject to racism, discrimination, racialized violence, and critiquing sexism, and sexism that they sometimes see emanating from their own community that limits the aspirations of young women to pursue careers, education, a life of their own making. So it's a time in which not only are Native Americans and African Americans in the streets marching, active, launching boycotts, but there's also this developing Latino activism. And part of that was the development of a Chicano movement, particularly here in California and in the Southwest, which spoke for the experiences of people of Mexican descent who for decades had been subject to violence, discrimination, a variety of forms of legal discrimination. Remember, we began our study of race and civil rights with a Mendez decision here in California in 1947, which was an effort to overturn discrimination in California public schools that specifically targeted Latinos. So discrimination in public schools was not exclusive to African Americans in the South, it was widespread. And here in the Southwest, it manifests in efforts to deny Latinos and Chicanos in particular an education. And so that led to the activism we're describing here. The man most associated with Brown Power, Latino activism in the 1960s, Cesar Chavez, who was the son of migrant workers, and he saw in the experiences of his parents the way in which workers in the billion-dollar agribusiness industry here in the Southwest were subject to harassment, violence, and in particular, a variety of means designed to prevent them from exercising a fundamental American right, the right of assembly. This was used in a campaign against unionization. I mentioned on the previous slide the 1936 Citrus War, which took place in Orange County, not too far from us here, where local police in Brea and Fullerton and other cities in Orange County came out and beat the hell out of striking workers, most of them Chicanos, who were seeking not only the chance to lobby for higher wages and better working conditions, but the very right to form a union, which is one of those fundamental rights in the Bill of Rights, the freedom of assembly, along with the freedom of speech that comes with being a union who is advancing this effort of reform in the form of higher wages, better working conditions. Cesar Chavez saw the way in which his parents were subject to that harassment, intimidation, and he vowed to advance the cause of unionization for farm workers in America so that they would be able to exercise fundamental rights like freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and pursue economic opportunity. So there's a lot here that again rhymes with, sounds a lot like the efforts we've described previously among African Americans and Native Americans. What was Cesar Chavez working for? Well, nothing extra, nothing beyond what should already be the rights of all citizens. He was demanding that these Americans be able to exercise fundamental rights in a nation that stylized itself as a beacon of freedom and opportunity, namely right of assembly, right to unionize, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. He partnered with Dolores Huerta and in 1962 formed their first effort, the National Farm Workers Association, which was a coalition of farm workers. They banded together with Asian American farm workers, Filipino Americans, and launched boycotts against the growers in an effort to put pressure on growers. That too is something that rhymes a lot with other incidences in the modern civil rights movement that we've learned about here. Boycotts, using leverage, using a consumer economy now in the cause of civil rights. We saw the Montgomery bus boycott. We talked about campaigns like Don't Buy Where You Can't Work, advanced by African Americans. Cesar Chavez in the 1960s, seeing the success of those efforts, working in concert with people like Dr. King, who he had a close association with, launched similar efforts against that billion-dollar industry, hoping to urge American consumers to use their leverage in a way that would force growers to grant to farm workers, again, nothing extra, nothing beyond what should already be the right of all American citizens, namely here, the right of assembly, the right to form a union. Dolores Huerta is still alive today. And this is another reminder to us in these lectures that where we are now in the class, when we are examining late 20th century America, we're no longer talking about history. We're talking about our contemporary America. I've stressed in these lectures how the events in this period so influence all of us and the way in which we, alive in the 21st century, inherit these efforts and must continue them forward. I've talked about how people who experience the events we have described here are still alive. Dolores Huerta is still an activist. She is deeply committed to a variety of social justice efforts. She's a feminist, an advocate for workers' rights, union rights. She's an environmentalist. And she's still alive today. So we're no longer talking about history now. We're talking about the here and now. We're talking about people who are still alive and carrying forward these efforts. She worked with Cesar Chavez. She worked to build a coalition with farm workers in this part of the Southwest in California, launch boycott efforts against grape growers in Kern County, strikes against growers, activism here in this remarkable period of the 1960s. 1966, Huerta and Chavez formed the United Farm Workers, a national movement to unionize farm workers around the country, and they launched their boycott now nationwide. This sparks a backlash. That too is a continuity here. And Chavez was openly criticized by the governor of California in the 1960s, Ronald Reagan, who said this was communism, referred to Cesar Chavez as a communist for daring to urge consumers to use their leverage in a consumer capitalist economy against the big growers who were using these means to stop and prevent union formulation and formation. So when the growers become targeted in this way, well, Reagan says that's a communist thing. That's a communist plot. Cesar Chavez is a socialist, a communist, red baiting Cesar Chavez because he dared to critique the way in which capitalism in the hands of a few growers had worked against the livelihoods and living standards of farm workers. Richard Nixon, himself a native Californian, elected to the White House in 1968, would also, as president, criticize Chavez. So the conservative movement, which has been in the background of these lectures and will soon be in the foreground of a lecture coming soon, was often very critical of the efforts of Chavez, Huerta, and the United Farm Workers as they pursued, again, basic rights that all Americans should be guaranteed and economic opportunity. They wanted to form a union, freedom of assembly. They wanted to advocate for their interests, freedom of speech. And what do they want? Well, they wanted their chance to pursue the American dream, buy a house, send their kids to college. They wanted that post-war economic ideal in America, often defined by consumerism, that African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos had been actively denied through forms of discrimination. So much here that intersects and connects with other movements we've described. It's about rights. It's about freedom. It's about the rights that all citizens should be guaranteed. It's about emphatically stating, I too am an American, like we saw with African Americans and Native Americans. It's about economic opportunity at its heart. Civil rights is more than just voting and sitting at a lunch counter and ordering a BLT. It's about jobs, housing, education, the very things that make you free in America in the 20th and now 21st century, and using similar strategies like boycotts that were successful by other groups we've encountered. For good or for bad, through this process, Cesar Chavez, particularly through the criticism that he elicited, becomes the face of the Latino movement. And for good, it's because he was a figure that more and more Americans saw, understood, connected to, and often supported in the boycotts that he launched. He, like many other civil rights activists, helped to build sympathy for his cause. For bad, though, Cesar Chavez tends to be the one Latino some Americans can name, and his standing often has dwarfed the efforts of Dolores Huerta, who was just as integral and key to the movement as Chavez. So there's a good and a bad that comes with the way in which Chavez became the face and symbol of this movement. The good, though, was the way in which his presence, his dogged determination, and efficacy led to greater awareness of the discrimination against Latinos and farm workers in particular, and then also led to great appreciable gains for this group he advocated for, because by the early 70s, under pressure from boycotts, the large growers in California and later around the country recognized the United Farm Workers, and they were able to negotiate contracts for their workers with higher wages, better working conditions, a chance to indeed vault into the middle class and make those economic gains that are key and vital to being a free American in a free society. In the early 1970s, very common here in California to see people wearing t-shirts that said boycott grapes, posters that said boycott grapes, urging white American consumers who were not well versed in the plight of farm workers to feel a connection with people who, again, were Americans, American citizens, who simply wanted to exercise their freedoms and pursue an American dream. And through those successful efforts, boycotts, pressure mounted, and the large growers, as a result, were forced to recognize the United Farm Workers and enter into negotiations that ultimately had an appreciable impact on the standards of living of farm workers. Well, how do we make sense of all of this now that we've come to the end of these two lectures on race and civil rights? Well, there are the events we have enunciated, and many of them are remarkable, dramatic, and sobering in many ways. And then there's the larger contours and themes that we've stressed, namely change and unchange. Hopefully at this point in these lectures you can understand and really appreciate the remarkable changes that occur in this period, where legal discrimination is dismantled in a variety of ways, where voting rights that had been actively denied for decades are restored and claimed anew, where there are greater opportunities for Native Americans, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans as a result of the remarkable sacrifices made by people who were willing to put their lives on the line to make this country more just and more democratic. But in every instance of such advances, we have seen backlashes. And in lectures to come, we'll talk about how in many ways those backlashes proved to be very successful and help put in place institutions, figures, politicians who will work to retrench a lot of those gains. So coiled together, braided together with the remarkable change of this period, those backlashes and forces of unchange, and even the changes themselves could only have so much of an impact. Legal change in law, significant, but doesn't change attitudes, commitments to things like racial hierarchy and white supremacy that remain to this day. You can't reverse centuries of unfreedom in one or two generations. The impact, particularly economically, has been hard to shift if for a century you've been denied home ownership. And we talked earlier in the class about many of the systems in place that denied African Americans and other racial minorities the opportunity to own a home. You've been denied for a century, for generations, a chance to build wealth. And that helps speak to the remarkable wealth gap that exists in America, even in the 21st century, after the successes of civil rights. And that's one domain where there has been a lack of change. As we've seen in these lectures, we may now have legal protections in place, but the goal of so many activists, whether it was Chavez, Huerta, King, A. Philip Randolph, was often economic in its focus: jobs, housing, education, and those changes have been much slower in America, where we see such a huge racial wealth gap today. And so that too is part of this intertwining of change and unchange. There's the remarkable change, there's the backlash that retards and limits the change, and there's the things that never changed: attitudes, racial attitudes, commitments to white supremacy and racial privilege. And then the area where there's the greatest lack of change in civil rights was in the economic realm, where so many of the goals of Randolph and others went unrealized. Another way of thinking about what we've learned in these lectures is, again, American history is an argument without end. And what we see here is a field of contest rather than a linear development in the way forward. That this remains, in many ways, a field of contest, as race and identity and citizenship are more in the focus today than they have been in the last few decades. In the late 20th century, the culture wars tended to flare around issues of sexuality, gender, family values, and phrases like that. But that began to end in the early 21st century. Instead, beginning with the presidency of Barack Obama, race and citizenship and racial identity returned as the focus of the contemporary culture wars that we live in today, and that's only been intensified in the Trump era with Charlottesville, the emergence of now white supremacy online, groups like the Proud Boys and others, and the recent insurrection at the Capitol. So this too speaks to change and unchange, and the remaining field of argument and contest that is more intense today than it had been in the 1990s or the first decade of the 21st century. Hopefully also one of the lessons you take from these lectures and can apply to today is the importance of activism, agency. Ultimately, what we have seen here in terms of progress and appreciable change came at the behest of determined people who refused to accept second-class status, who were willing to put their lives on the line. One of the great tragedies of the information you have been presented with in these lectures is that it took the death of people. It took martyrs. It took people like Medgar Evers, those 3 young men in Philadelphia, Mississippi, Dr. King and others. That's what it took to bring about this change. We have seen in the argument without end how people will refuse to accept being denied freedom, citizenship, who will force America to become what it steadfastly often was designed to refuse to be, a nation of equality and freedom for all. The activism agency we've seen in these lectures demonstrates that America, to the extent that it is a free and democratic nation today, is so because of people who were hitherto previously denied that status and those freedoms. They're the ones who made America more democratic and free. And so there are a lot of lessons here, too, that I think we can take and also apply to the burden that we all inherit as a result now in the 21st century.